G'day everyone. So I pretty much had this video prepped and ready to record when this whole thing happened. I figured I couldn't really do a Sargon/Carl video without at least mentioning it, so here's a little spiel with my thoughts on this whole episode. I got a certain level of sympathy for the people who attempted this demonstration. It's true, we should be denying genuine fascists their platforms, and given that those involved clearly believe that's what Carl is, I can understand the motivation. And without agreeing with the idea that Carl is a fascist, I've got a certain level of sympathy for that position as well. I find some, if not most of his views to be deplorable. But deplorable views or not, I do have some pretty major issues with this line of thinking and the action as well. Firstly, despite my very strong dislike of Carl and his positions, I do not think Carl is a fascist. He is wrong about a great many things. He has supporters who are definitely fascist, and he has made some big mistakes. Most recently, and I think his biggest error, is debating Dick Spencer. But in making that mistake, along with other errors, Carl has been quite clear on his opinion of fascists and their views. Carl has gone about expressing himself in a terrible and frankly disgusting way, like dropping N-bombs at the alt-right in an attempt to piss them off. But he clearly does not side with the extreme right. He is therefore not a fascist. The left response to people who are right of centre, which Carl is by the way, but are not fascist, requires a bit more nuance. I do therefore, without thinking I know the best response always, think that this action could have been better thought out. And in watching the video, I think it's clear it wasn't well thought out. The black bloc tactics were ad hoc as hell. A group in the crowd only covered up after they were on camera. These folks were largely wearing casual and identifiable clothes anyway, and they got out muscled very quickly. Now of course, I have the benefit of hindsight, but it's also true that the best measure of an action is in its outcome. And this was a disaster. I think the people involved know it too. Even during the action, there's this moment where Buddy puts his hands on his head, looking dejected. And I feel for him. We've all fucked up in our lives at some point, and we all can imagine just how bad this guy is feeling right now. But again, it was a fuck up, and that needs to be acknowledged. The result of this action was turning a poorly attended session with Carl into the photo op of his dreams. I think that a far better approach to Carl and others like him is what has been working for a while now. Respond to what he says that's wrong or immoral with corrections and ethics. He's hitched his wagon to the star of being a skeptical and accurate intellectual pretty strongly. I do think he at least has been pretty hurt by being shown not to be that. Discourse so far has been the most effective response to Carl, so let's keep that going, shall we? And there's my segue into what I wanted this video to be about. Carl's Colourism is the New Racism video. Okay, so there are a lot of moments in Carl's video where, well, they would have warranted a response all on their own. Especially the false equivalence between not being ashamed of your ethnicity and overcoming gender dysphoria. There's those deplorable views again. But if I'm going to do responses, and I've essentially said this before, I think it's going to be more helpful to focus on the central theses. I'm pointing this out again just so no one who watches this thinks that I don't think that shit is important. I just have to focus my efforts here. So, as I took it, the central theses in this video by Carl were: first, intersectional commentators have attempted to redefine racism to include the concept of power, which has excluded the very problematic behaviour of bigotry within race groups, which Carl doesn't like because of the second main idea: it is far more effective to combat racism with colour blindness. And to that I say, yeah, nah. So let's assess the idea of the change of a definition of racism. Now it's absolutely true. The change of a definition of racism, as discussed and promoted by many on the social justice side of politics, is absolutely that. A change. From the traditional definition, the new proposal, as we said, includes the concept of power. The reason why this change is proposed is because we have seen an evolution of our understanding of the issues at play. Once upon a time, racism was more explicit, and a definition that focused on those explicit views was perhaps sufficient. Since this time, values have somewhat changed, and much of this explicit racism went away. These events, however, were not accompanied by the achievement of equality between races on many measures. We understand, now, that racism can occur in an implicit fashion. It can be a result of the institutions, past and present, that did or indeed do now lend favour to, in the case of the West, white people and their culture. Power is then a real and important consideration in this discussion, and at present it is all too easy for power dynamics to be ignored. The proposal for a change is therefore a practically minded response to what we now know. Leading on from that, Carl is of course right. This new definition of racism would not include what is termed colorism in the video Sargon is talking about. The bigotry we see within race groups would not meet this updated definition, and it has therefore necessitated the invention of the new word, because that bigotry is also important. Personally, I don't really have a problem with using words differently, or coming up with new ones to communicate our ideas better than we once could. It remains to be seen if these terms become part of the common lexicon, but this wouldn't be the first time we adapted the meaning of words. Far from it, of course. but let me demonstrate this with an example that might be close to home. The conservatives among us have often taken feminism to be a term that has evolved from meaning equality for women to something else. And if you go here, you can see Karl himself saying that he would have been okay with being called a feminist during the second wave, but no more given the third. Karl has updated his understanding of what is implied by the term feminism, and without agreeing with him, I guess I could see why he wouldn't want to be called a feminist now. Under a modern understanding, that does not define him at all, so we won't use it for him. Easy. But again, the word's meaning has ostensibly evolved in Karl's view, so why can't the same occur now? Now, of course, the problem with this is that even if Karl was to accept that the word racism too can change in meaning, Karl does not accept the power structures argument. And there's my segue into the second point, colourblindness. I'm just realising I might be a little bit literally colourblind. Anyway, colourblindness as a concept in this context is one that would be great given the right circumstances, but as before, we understand these days that concepts like privilege and power are important. Colourblindness, ironically, blinds us to something we shouldn't be blind to. Until we actually can get rid of the very real issues of institutional racism, colourblindness will not be sufficient to achieve real equality between racial groups. Now, as I said, I do get that Karl and co don't accept this argument, but the thing is, to an extent, it doesn't matter. There's data to show that power between race groups does exist. Take a pick from the slew of examples. I gave you one before that I often use. Currently anointed queen of the SJW's ContraPoints has a great video on examples close to her home. And here's one from my home that I think is extremely telling. Indigenous life expectancy in Australia is approximately 10 years less than that of mainstream Australia. So, to sum up, power between race groups matters, so colourblindness can't work. There is a real issue then with not including power in our discussion of racism, and I think that given that the currently accepted definition of racism does allow, for example, white people getting called names to accurately suggest that they're experiencing racism too, this does imply that a change is warranted. This change would necessitate the introduction of colorism as a concept, but really, that's just fine. We do often change our understanding of words. I honestly don't get the pushback. So that's me for today. Hope you enjoyed. Comments, thoughts, or corrections welcome. Until next time, this has been Yeah Nah. Thanks for watching.